Welcome to Pixel Latte, a show about the intersection of pop culture and video games. This week, we're talking about the commercial flop, critical darling, Spec Ops: The Line. I'm Lee, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, Lewis.
Hello, Lee.
Let's just jump into it. Sound good?
Sounds good to me. Let's go.
All right, so I want to start the show by talking about what Spec Ops: The Line means to each of us, because I think that's as important to this conversation as what Spec Ops is and what its legacy is and what it represents for the industry. So if you don't mind, I would actually like to go first. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think that's good, and I kind of agree. I think that's really going to help also frame where we're coming from when we talk about this game, because our personal experiences are really important to this game.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So for me, Spec Ops represents a promised paradigm shift in video games that never really happened. It is a game that, while clumsy and sophomoric, is very unashamed about what it is. And without getting too far ahead of ourselves, I will just say that it is a story about the destructive nature of American interventionism, and it wove its narrative and mechanics in such a way that was revolutionary at its time, and I think did it in a way that few video games have managed to do to this day, certainly in the first-person, third-person shooter genre, right? So I played Spec Ops when I was a sophomore in college. I played it at the same time I was taking a 300-level existentialism class, and it just blew my mind because of what it was trying to do and what it did do. It's one of those games that, for me, is hard to play a second time, and I think for a lot of people, it's hard to play a first time, even 8 years later, both because of its really muddy control system, to put it generously, but also because the narrative and the subject matter, which is a bit war crimey, and it's a bit M. Night Shyamalan-y too, you know?
A bit war crimey, a bit. I don't, not to jump the gun here, but that's you're underselling that.
So what did it mean to you? Like, why is Spec Ops such a pivotal experience for you?
I think for me, it's, I think I have a lot less impressive things to say about it, but I think to me, it's a deeply personal game. And it's a deeply personal game because it came out at an important part of my life where, a close friend that I had grown up with had been purportedly murdered, and that had definitely taken an impact on my emotional state. I had also become more and more involved with sort of ethics and philosophy, and at that time, I had become more and more conscious of both the extent of human suffering around the world, which I think is still incalculable, but also non-human animal suffering around the world as I became more engaged in the animal rights community, in a sense. And so life was just a big ball of suffering to me, and this game presented more of that suffering and presented arguments around it that I think were really engaging to me at the time, and still engaging, and engaging in a way that I think a lot of games aren't necessarily still engaging with. But I mean, again, I don't want to jump the gun on this conversation. And there's a lot of guns in this conversation about these war games. So maybe we get started.
Yeah, no, and I just want to take a moment and thank you for sharing your story. And I just want to sort of, it's interesting. One thing I've been thinking about recently is how our perception of certain video games, they become tied up inexplicably with real life memories. You know, for example, I started playing Persona 5 a few months before my dad died of cancer. I never finished the game, although I still plan on finishing it, especially if they bring it to PC as Persona 5 Royal. But I booted up Persona 5 Strikers a few days ago, and it was an overwhelming emotional experience for me. There's no other way to play it. There's no other way to say it. And I actually just had to set the game down and walk away because I felt this rush of emotions. They were both, it was nice to see the characters from Persona 5 again, and then also just sort of the memories of those last few months I had with my dad came rushing back. And I think it's important to acknowledge how our life events affect our perception of games, and also how our life events also affect the development of games, which brings me to my next point, which is the development of Spec Ops: The Line. What a segue, right?
That is quite the segue, and you're totally right there. For me, when it was time to go back to Spec Ops: The Line, revisit this game, and try to remember what it was about, and also the significance of it, I was overcome with emotions, and I definitely got teary eyed at the least for a little bit there. And even talking about it and thinking about it now, it makes me tear up a little bit. It's not easy, and I think that it certainly frames our experience with the games. It is impossible to this day, abstract of what the game is even trying to express, for me to enjoy necessarily Spec Ops: The Line because of how close it is to my that time of my life for me. But anyways, yeah, let's get back to it. So Spec Ops: The Line. Who made it, Lee?
Yeah, so Spec Ops: The Line is a 2012 game by Jaeger Development that was published by 2K. Production began, I want to say, in 2007. It is the latest and at the moment last game in a long series of games with the Spec Ops title. Just in case anyone has forgotten or they weren't born yet, this was the era, 2012 was the era of the brown gray military shooters. So that, think Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, Brother in Arms, Battlefield, Gears of War, those games were the games of the time, and they spawned countless imitators, right? So in Spec
Totally.
Ops: The Line, you control Captain Walker, who is sent into a post-catastrophe Dubai on a recon mission with two other Delta Force operators. As the story progresses, and as Walker commits more war crimes, his sanity starts to deteriorate. It was marketed as a typical military shooter, which according to one developer was simply because the marketing folks just didn't know how to market it, and not because they were trying to pull a fast one over the gaming community, which is sort of a popular myth attributed to this game's marketing campaign. Lewis, have I missed anything super critical in the elevator pitch of what Spec Ops: The Line is?
Yeah, I think you're definitely missing a critical point here, which is, I want to emphasize this was the era of brown gray shooters, and this was, in fact, a very orange shooter from the outset. So you're going to get into something crazy when brown and gray is maybe not the primary color anymore.
That is the dumbest fucking joke you've ever made.
Yeah,
And you've made a lot of dumb jokes. I was like, no, what did I miss? No, it's just Lewis being Lewis. Jesus Christ. Okay, so next talking point. This game is a lot. It is a lot more than we have time to go into. There's a reason why people still talk about this game to this day. We could do a whole episode about the story and the mechanics of Spec Ops: Line, but those videos have already been made. So we want to try and keep this part of the discussion short. So I will put timestamps in the description of this video. Fast forward if you are already familiar with Spec Ops. Stick around if you need a refresher. So, as I mentioned earlier, the game is about American interventionism in both a metaphorical and a very literal way, although some of the creators didn't see it as being explicitly anti-war. It comes off anti-war in a way that few books, movies, and certainly video games are, right? It was inspired by things like Heart of Darkness, Generation Kill, Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket. I think at the very least you could call it anti-American interventionism. It was, and still is, a very physically imposing game that was meant to question both our relationship with war as an entertainment medium, specifically in video games, and serve as a rebuke to the popularity of games like Call of Duty, Gears of War, Battlefield, etc., 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 and all their dozens of imitators, right? So Jaeger was giving carte blanche basically to do whatever the fuck they wanted to with the game by 2K, which is highly unusual. An interesting factoid is that one of the people that they worked with at 2K, Greg Kasavin, went on to form Supergiant Games, which is a studio that is very interested in solving the same sort of mechanical narrative issues that Spec Ops was, and to a lesser extent also wants to talk about some very meaty subjects. I think it's also worth noting, and I know I'm rambling on here, so I'm going to try to wrap this part up, is that the role that sand plays in this game, both as a mechanic and a literary device. So Walt Williams, one of the main writers, and Corey Davis, the lead designer, they both experienced freak weather events, including freak dust storms in Germany and Texas, and they were aware about a story of a Persian army that vanished into the Egyptian desert during a sandstorm. So Williams, who I should note comes from a military family, also spent a lot of time in Oman, and he was struck by its sands, which, there's a lot of sand in Oman, right? But it made him wonder at the wisdom of creating a city in a part of the earth where the only permanent thing is impermanence. And all this is to say, in a very long roundabout way, everything is covered in a catastrophic amount of sand, and that is the least bad thing that will happen to Dubai, and that is a very powerful statement in and of itself. But also the use of sand, the use of a city like Dubai with like tons and tons of skyscrapers that is just covered in an oppressive amount of sand is similar. It's used as the metaphor in the same way that the Nong River is in Apocalypse Now, and that the further you descend into the city, the further you go into a sort of primal darkness beyond what we would consider "quote unquote" civilized.
Wow, that is a lot. And I want to say, I was really dusty on a lot of that. So thanks for clearing that up, Lee.
I don't even know how to respond to these jokes anymore.
These aren't jokes. These are reality. Okay, you just got to live with it. Okay, so I have some thoughts on what you said.
Okay.
I think we're gonna move right on. So
okay.
I concur with a lot of what you said. A lot of good thoughts there. For me, what Spec Ops: The Line really represents is sort of a genesis for shooting games, and I mean literal shooting games, taking narratives more seriously and engaging with the politics of war. Now, I say this: there is a genre of games that have long taken the narrative very seriously. Immersive sims, which is a subgenre of shooting games. Immersive sims are very different in design than a traditional shooting game. And Spec Ops: The Line is very much a sort of traditional shooting game in its mechanical design. Like the main way you interface with everything is shooting. Whereas in an immersive sim, like it's more RPG-like. There's branching dialogue paths, there's usually stealth paths, there's pacifist playthroughs, and so on. The Spec Ops: The Line is a shooting game. You shoot everything, and there's a lot of story and kind of enveloping that experience, and that is unique. And I love that about this game. Another thing I like a lot is sort of the unclear kind of moral ambiguity that runs throughout it. There's a lot of grayness, and a lot of times you don't even realize you're being presented with a moral.
I thought there was a lot of orangeness. Make up your mind. How does it feel? How does it feel to have your monologue cut by a stupid joke? Huh?
It feels great. So great. I'm probably gonna cut some cheese here in a moment.
Cut some sheets?
Yeah, okay. So you know what? There's a lot of moral ambiguity in this game. Like a lot of the moral ambiguity and you cutting me off, okay? And
I don't think there was anything ambiguous about it. It was a dick move. Please continue.
Well, stop slapping me with it. But anyways, there's a lot of moral ambiguity in this game. You don't in the way it's presented isn't clear like it is in a lot of other games. A lot of games that I even love, like BioShock and so on, where the choices are very clear, very upfront. This is good, this is bad. In Spec Ops: The Line, there's a lot of kind of ambient cases where you don't even realize, kind of emergent moral cases where you don't realize that there's even an alternative or that was a situation until you're left to deal with the aftermath of making that choice, right? And it's just weaved so expertly into the gameplay and the narrative that I think it's a bit of a masterclass, right? You can talk about how this game feels mechanically a bit like shit, but like the way that it handles weaving together mechanics, narrative, overarching story, meta commentary, and everything together, it's just a masterclass in games anyway, and how you weave all these things together. And it's been said many times now, but bad mechanics are bad mechanics, right? It's hard to enjoy playing this game if that's even what it's about. But on the same level, I also enjoy noise music and Merzbow, so who am I to judge this sort of masochism? It's got its own sorts of fun that it's trying to present.
So, real quick, I just want to respond to a couple of points that you have, and then I will shut up about Spec Ops. Is that okay? Well, shut up about like the mechanics of Spec Ops. Is that fine?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Well, do you think it's fine or is it fine? Because, I don't want to get, I don't want there being any tension between us, any simmering tension that,
There's no ambiguity in the tension between us, okay? I want to be very clear. Let's just cut to the chase.
Okay. So real quick, it's like less than 2 minutes, I swear. You talked about like the mechanics and the narrative weaving together, and it goes beyond that. It's also the UI, like even from the menu screen, the splash screen at the beginning, the title screen. it's screaming at you what sort of game this is going to be. There's the upside down American flag. There's Jimi Hendrix's 1969 Woodstock rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. There's the fact that the scene that it's displaying gets increasingly dystopian, and it's already pretty dystopian to start out with, right? And so it is telling you that there is a very real human cost to war, to both the combatants in the war and then also those caught in the confines of the theater. And like you said, a lot of people have talked about, actually, let me back up. You talked a lot about the sort of like the gun mechanics, right? Like, immersive sim versus FPS or whatever. And this, one of the really cool tiny details about this game that makes it such a great game to me is its use of the Desert Eagle. So again, this is very much a story about how we like to roleplay as heroes and our relationship with war, specifically from a pop culture entertainment standpoint. From what I can tell, right, I haven't fired a ton of guns. I haven't fired any guns at all since I was in my 20s, is that few, if any, armed forces actually use a Desert Eagle. First off, it's heavy for a sidearm. It's low capacity, and it has a pretty insane recoil. And yet, it is a gun that pops up again over and over and over and over in our pop culture. Like, I think there's like 500 documented instances of it being in movies. It is an absolutely overused gun. It is a meme gun, if such a thing exists. And when the game uses a Desert Eagle, it always uses it in the context of Walker wanting to be a glorious hero, and later in the game, a very violent hero motivated by revenge and hatred of the other more so than his actual mission. And so it's those little things like that that reinforces the game's message. It's mechanics and narrative, UI always working in tandem together that make this game such a phenomenal game, even though it plays like ass in molasses, right?
Yeah, 100%. I would take some of those arguments and reform them a little bit myself. The way that the game works with the UI and a lot of the presentational aspects, it makes those presentational aspects mechanics of the narrative and what it's trying to convey itself. So I think it makes a lot of aspects of game and game design more mechanical than a lot of other games even think about doing, right? And it's awesome how it does a lot of that. I would say that the weaving together and how it puts all of this into a coherent package is where this is a masterclass, even though I would maybe criticize individual aspects of it, right? But how it all comes together itself, it is worth studying, it is worth looking at, it is worth playing.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this game is that if you play this game to the end and really internalize its message, you realize that the only way to not play to play this game is to not play it at all, right? Like there's a lot that has been said about this game's ambiguous moral choices, and I think we'll get into this a little bit later on. Maybe we'll get into it now. We'll see. But there's a moment about a third of the way through the game where you are forced by the game's narrative to fire white phosphorus into armed combatants that you did not know were protecting civilians. And up until that point, and after that point, any similar decision you have is ambiguous, and you could make decision A or decision B or decision C, right? So for example, there's one point where you have to scare away some civilians. You could scare them away by firing your gun in the air, or you could just shoot one of them, or you could shoot 500 of them. Either way, the civilians are going to run away. And it's an ambiguous moral choice. It's also a choice that fundamentally does not matter, right? It does not matter one bit to the game's narrative. And that's the same thing with this white phosphorus scene that a lot of people really thought was jarring, not just because of how graphic it was. It was extremely graphic. During playtesting, people often had to walk away because it was so graphic at the time. Like, just the level of technical fidelity and everything was not great for playtesting, right? But a lot of people were like, this is bad because it's not giving me any sort of choice. And yet one of the overarching things is there's a discussion about, do you actually have any choice? And your only real choice to be morally good is to just stop playing the fucking game. And so it's just a really interesting I
Yeah,
just want to note how interesting that scene is, basically.
there's not, we could spend an entire episode talking about the awesome things in this game. And I think that, the final thing I want to say on that before we move on is that, there's a growing debate in gaming, and it's a debate that I certainly have my own opinions on, but should the player character be one of full agency where the player expresses their own opinions in every scene, or should we allow should there be games basically where you're actually playing a character in a setting? You're playing not yourself or representing yourself, but you're playing a character that comes with their own opinions, their feelings, or whatever. So in a way, it's kind of like an actor portraying someone in a movie. You're portraying someone in a game. And I feel like the Spec Ops The Line makes a strong argument for the latter, especially in the case of trying to express something that I think any player with agency would choose not to express, and it would undercut the message.
Right, totally. 100% agreed. And we are done dissecting Spec Ops The Line because we will be here for another 4 hours if we mull over every mechanical and narrative decision in this game.
We can literally talk, because so again, this game, it feels miserable to play, but you can beat it in 4 or 5 hours. We could probably talk about the game far longer than we actually played it. But, I think we do need to start getting into some of Call of Duty, Black Ops 5, Cold War.
No more half-assing it. We're doing an intracerebral injection.
Injecting directly into the brain could provoke seizures, or worse.
Damn, through the eye socket. You sure about this, Doc?
The memory should begin almost immediately.
Bell, listen to me. I need you to remember. Think back to our time in Vietnam. One more time. We need to finish what we started. We had a job to do.
Well, it's a Call of Duty game, and at this point, I feel like anyone listening to this show or anyone kind of engaged in this conversation will have probably played a few dozen Call of Duty games, or enough Call of Duty games that it feels like a few dozen at this point. In Call of Duty Black Ops 5 Cold War, and I'm just going to stop saying 5. I don't think that's in the official title, but that's what it is. In Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, you play a nameless protagonist by the name of Bell, but you're really following what is probably the main protagonist around, Russell Adler. And he is a very brash sort of individual who has no qualms beating people up for the greater good. Kind of like Spec Ops The Line, it serves in a way. You can feel the pastiche of its own influences coming through. One notable one for me was Spy Game, the movie. And Russell Adler even looks like sort of the protagonist from that movie in a way, although G.I. Joe'd up all to hell. Probably a few steroid injections here and there. Everyone in this game just looks like a G.I. Joe character, and it's obscene. Anyways, there's so many differences between these games. And I know that is a short overview of Call of Duty Black Ops 5 Cold War, but if I told you it was a Call of Duty game in the Black Ops franchise and takes place in the Cold War, you've basically got the narrative set up for it. So yeah, I think, just some quick differences between the games here that stood out to me. Spec Ops The Line is really interested in showing the downsides of conflict and violence and interventionism in a larger political scale. Whereas Call of Duty, at best presents this as a neutral thing, and at worst appears to endorse it. There is the way the game starts with the response to the Iran hostage crisis, where you and Adler are chasing guys across rooftops in Turkey, where there is seemingly 1,000 guys in every building that you pass by that you have to kill. And at the end of it, you're kind of you capture this one guy that's embroiled in this Iran hostage crisis, and you have this kind of false choice where you can either save him or kill him, but it doesn't really matter because for the greater good, you gotta kill him right there, or you got to be a pussy and not kill him. This game has a masculinity thing going on, to be sure. But yeah, I think where this game gets interesting is that it's really trying to work within the sort of hedonistic framework of what a Call of Duty game is. And it's trying to convey this kind of conspiratorial narrative. You're literally in this, there's this hub world between all the levels where you have this kind of giant conspiracy board with all this, these pieces of yarn and tape connecting all these images together. It's trying to give the aesthetic of the Cold War conflict and the espionage without necessarily grappling deeply with a lot of political themes. But yeah, I think Sorry, Lee. It appeared that you wanted to say something there.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons why why we want to talk about Call of Duty in relationship to Spec Ops, because we didn't really explain that transition, is the ways in which video games have reacted to ongoing wars and war crimes in the Middle East. So let's just think about movies and music to begin with, right? So in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and I realize the Cold War is set a couple decades before 9/11. Bear with me, I'll get there in a second. The country was understandably a bit jingoistic, right? So famously, the Dixie Chicks were shit canned because of their negative stance on the U.S. invasion of Iraq. You also saw any scenes of mass destruction were excised from movies and TV shows, and if a film was made about war, they were very, very pro-American about it. Famously, there is an instance of the supervillain Dr. Doom crying about 9/11, and then we also decided to start calling French fries freedom fries because France was one of our earliest critics of the invasion. So basically you had a situation where for a long time the most popular anti-war film was Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds, and the most popular anti-war band was Green Day. And so it's not to say that other films or bands didn't exist at the periphery. System of the Down was very popular, but they weren't popular in the same way that Green Day was. And it was certainly a stark comparison to the 60s and sort of the culture that followed after the 60s, where we saw a very strong anti-war movement. We saw the rise of people like Bob Dylan and Muhammad Ali and others. And of course, this is all happening in the civil rights era as well. So it is a bit of an apples to potatoes comparison, but it is a noticeable difference. And so what are video games doing about all of this? Absolutely, totally fucking nothing. Call of Duty 4? Was that the first?
That was
in my mind. I want to say next
Warfare.
year, but
yeah,
that was the first. We saw that and we thought, wow, this is gonna be something. I remember when it came out and we saw the nukes go off. It was like, this game, it has something to say. There's that famous AC-130 chopper scene, or not chopper, gunship, where you just boop, 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 dead. Boop, 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 boop,
that you could be a rapper. You keep that up, man. You beatboxing. You're close.
Yeah, I'm close. Yeah,
dropping them bombs.
It's callous jokes aside. It seemed
yeah,
like
that's terrible. I'm so sorry. That is callous. Moving on.
Yeah, it seemed like the Call of Duty franchise could potentially be something, right? It seemed promising, and also we had Metal Gear, which is famously an anti-war franchise, and that was the end of all of that. It's just nothing but Medal of Honor, jingoistic, machoistic, chest pounding. This gun is like firing a 12-inch dick full of hot dick lead at brown people that I don't understand. America, fuck yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what makes Spec Ops interesting, and that's also what makes Call of Duty problematic, is that you had this groundbreaking game like Spec Ops that I think in its message, not its execution, but in its message and its attempted execution, is groundbreaking both from a video game perspective, but also just a movie and books. It is a good piece of media. And then you have Call of Duty doing absolutely fuck all with this, and it is the most popular franchise of all time for the most part. It's certainly within the FPS genre.
Yeah, and I really want to dial in there on something that you said, because I think it's critical for understanding this. A lot of the anti-war discourse in the kind of like, post 9/11 to where we are today, or, maybe 2010 is a better range on that. But a lot of that discourse was more at the periphery and existed in analogies and metaphors that existed within art. You said War of the Worlds, and it was an anti-war movie, but it was an anti-war movie through metaphors. And I bet, like, and not in a condescending way, most people were not going to see it for an anti-war message and probably didn't even get that out of it. And I know a lot of people listening to Green Day have no idea, just in conversation, about their anti-war message at any point in their career.
Despite the album being called American Idiot, just for the record.
With
I don't know.
a grenade in the hand. Like,
Yeah. There was nothing subtle at all about that album or anything on it. Like, Wake Me Up When September. I mean, anyway, sorry. Go on. Continue with your
That's
point.
about a sad day. Okay, it's ambiguous. I don't think these things were necessarily being as ambiguous, but contrasted with there wasn't a lot of like literal. Oftentimes they weren't as literal as Spec Ops was necessarily in its anti-war discourse, and I think that's part of what makes Spec Ops. Even you look at films, well-regarded films that came out around the same period. You have Hurt Locker, you have Argo, you have Zero Dark 30. A lot of these movies were anti-war, but they were anti-war in the sense of the personal cost of it. And I think Spec Ops: The Line spoke to that by showing the personal cost to your protagonist, which is an important part of the equation. But I think they often fell short in creating a sort of like political anti-war discourse to the same level that Spec Ops did. And they certainly did not have nearly the anti-war, anti-interventionist message that the game did. And I think that's where Spec Ops: The Line really stands out as a very important piece of not just video game, but like just an important media piece in this period, because it really stood out for its anti-war message.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say that I think another part of the equation for me is and I say R like as in everyone in America, how we understand, interpret, and our relationship with things that are anti-war. So, for example, let's think about Starship Troopers. Very clearly, they only made one, for the record, so it shouldn't be hard to figure out what thing I'm talking about. I'm just talking about a Starship Troopers movie that was made. There was never any sequels. At the time, people didn't get that it was parody. And they did not like it, to say the least. Very clearly parody, right? You have something like American History X, which very clearly does not have anything great to say about Nazis. Skinheads fucking love that shit, right? And I realize I'm conflating skinheads and Nazis, and I apologize to those groups of people, I suppose, for conflating your terrible ideologies into one, right? And then you have something like, trying to think of a third example, because we've always got to do things in threes.
Well, like another example that sticks out to me, and it's more on the music side, but you have like a lot of conservative military hawk politicians that just love the song Killing in the Name by Rage Against the Machine, just unironically. And it's like, wait, what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. We just fundamentally, we do not have a good understanding. Like, we just don't read between the lines. And it's baffling to me because it takes like 2 seconds to go, oh yeah, this is clearly anti-war, right? It's same with Jarhead. That was the other thing that I was trying to think of. Like, totally, Jarhead, yeah. Loved by the military, not super pro, let's go kill people film, right? So I think that's another reason why Spec Ops sticks out, is because the way its mechanics reinforce that message. And then again, by comparison, that's what makes Call of Duty's unwillingness or an ability to do anything even remotely close to that all the more disappointing to me. And the fact that there are not a lot of other games like Call of Duty, not like Call of Duty, there are plenty of games like Call of Duty, like Spec Ops: The Line, all the more disappointing to me.
Yeah, and I just, this is a total distraction, but again, I always find it infinitely disappointing that people can misunderstand the song Killing in the Name of. It very famously only has about like 5 or 6 lines of lyrics, unique lines of lyrics that are just repeated ad nauseum. And that's an intentional artistic like design to make its message as clear as possible. And yet still you have mass amounts of people just not understanding what the song is about. It's wild. I don't understand how people cannot understand that song.
To quote Outkast here, let's see here. How does that go? Y'all don't want to hear me, you just want to dance, basically. I'm butchering that.
Totally.
That's basically what it is no one wants to hear the message. They just want to fucking dance. They just want to blow up people. But I do think, and I will say that's fine. That's fun. We both love shooters. I think it becomes an issue in that it reinforces a dominant narrative that is very harmful to both marginalized folks, but then also people in positions of power. And then also, I'm just fucking sick and tired of it. I've been shooting brown people that speak a language that I don't understand for 20 years, and it's starting to feel kind of samey,
It's very rote. It's just incredibly exhausting. It's like World War II shooters were leading up to modern warfare, and I think that's a large part of what its reception was about. It's like, finally, not the 5,000th World War II game, but I want to take things back here, right? To backpedal a little bit. We've set up, kind of some of the post 9/11 political climate in which these games exist. Maybe we can talk a little bit about how these games respond to that political climate a little bit. You are a huge fan of Spec Ops: The Line, Lee. So what do you think that it has to say, or how it exists within this context a little bit more specifically?
I feel like I'm pretty good, unless we want to go into the nuances of its narrative. It is very much American interventionism is bad, right? You can see every decision that Conrad makes, which is the person that you are chasing, quote unquote, and then every decision that Walker makes, which is the main character, ends up being worse for the people there, right? Like they probably would have been okay if Walker had not come along. So for example, they still had water. And it's shown at the end of the game that the American military eventually gets there. So theoretically, maybe not everyone would have survived, but more people would have survived than just Walker, right? But because Walker went in there chasing Conrad, and Conrad had tried to evacuate people, and that had failed, and then Walker thinks he knows what he's doing best, and at one point in the game, he ends up destroying the water supply for the entire fucking city. All those people are hella dead, man. And I don't know how you could not read that as being like American interventionism is bad. That's the only possible takeaway you could get from it. If you think that destroying civilian water sources is great, you might seriously want to reevaluate your moral stances in life.
You might want to go find some professional help. It's not a good moral theory to live by. You're going to find yourself struggling in society,
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I want to take a moment here and talk a little bit about Black Ops Cold War more specifically and how it exists in this landscape, because it at the forefront it takes place in the Cold War. How could it have anything to do with the climate that we exist in now? And I think that's exactly it. It's not a game necessarily about the post 9/11 Middle Eastern conflicts that we've been embroiled in, but it's more the context in which it exists. And that context has to deal with the sort of expanding military industrial complex, right? Famously, Dwight D. Eisenhower warned about it in his presidency. A former general, or a former, he was a big official in the military. I have my military titles all mixed up here, but nonetheless, we had someone from that kind of warning us about the military-industrial complex at the tail end of his presidency. And what has happened since is that the military-industrial complex has very much become a thing, has grown year over year. But especially after 9/11, and especially as we have become more and more involved in the Middle East, it has grown tremendously. And a lot of that kind of bears on the Call of Duty franchise in this game. Very famously, you had Oliver North of the, kind of defamed from the Iran-Contra scandal, right? He was a lieutenant colonel. He was a core writer and a core influencer on the Black Ops franchise, notably Black Ops 2. Where he served as kind of like some principal role on the narrative. It's escaping me. But yeah, he had a huge impact on that story, and he was even featured in that game. You had like a model of him rendered in it, and there was some reverence for him in that game, which is, weird coming out of the scandal that happened just, 30 years prior. But nonetheless, yeah, you have seen more of this kind of crossover between the military and the people from the military influencing the media landscape and the stories they tell in various ways, right? Which tends to make them more pro-military in a lot of ways. Not always, right? But it frequently does.
Yeah, and I think it's especially interesting because Spec Ops: The Line never said it was political because no one really asked. Now people are starting to ask if a video game is political. And if you, and I'm not saying if, it's more like when asked, right? Because these are things that are of public record. If you ask a suit that's a marketing suit, a CEO or whatever, who's in charge of the Call of Duty franchise or virtually any Ubisoft franchise, they will tell you that the game is, whatever that game is not political. And that's problematic, right? Because first off, these games, they usually deal with war of some kind, right? I mean, the Division 2 isn't necessarily about a specific war, but it is set in a war zone. And when you have armed conflict between two opposing parties, that is fundamentally a political act. It is a forceful implementation of your will, of your philosophy, of your politics on someone else through violence. That is political, full stop. Second, if you have someone like Oliver North, like Ronald Reagan, who is featured very heavily in the game, like Yuri Bezmenov, who is featured in the ads for Cold War, and then you say that's not political, that's like double political, because those are highly political, highly contentious people. And to say, well, that's not political, you're basically saying, you're basically being okay with the status quo at best. And when you're okay with the status quo, usually what you're okay with is the continued exploitation and marginalization of certain classes, certain types of people, right? Or you're saying that it's not, I'm losing my train of thought here, that it's not.
Just got to get it more back on the tracks. Just throw more coal in the engine.
Yeah, that didn't help. You're saying that it's not.
It's
yeah,
not.
I don't know what I was trying to say. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's good. This is all. It's all overwhelming, and I fully agree with you. It's, words out of my own heart. Engaging in war of any kind, engaging in armed conflict of any kind is inherently a political act, because it answers the question of how do we engage with this conflict, and that is a political question. These games are fundamentally political, and you hit on a few critical things there that I think we really need to talk about, right? Some very messy things that the game just kind of drops in without much context. The game here being Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. You mentioned Reagan there. There's two figures here, Reagan, and then there's Yuri Bezmenov. We need to talk about both of them, right? And a lot of this, and the game's usage of them. So starting with Reagan, right? We have the portrayal in this game, which his model is just I think animation-wise, just graphically, there's a lot of fidelity to his model. It's gorgeous. And actually, scratch that. He is not a beautiful person, and he in real life or this game. But
no, let it be known that Lewis stands the Gipper. Okay.
Yeah,
confirmed Gipper stand. Continue.
I have his picture in my bathroom. Anyways, yeah, he was. Reagan was a very pivotal figure in modern life and in modern politics. You constantly hear, especially today, you hear a lot of conservative politicians claiming that we need to go back to the Reagan days, like we need to cut back to those days. And Reagan was a very important figure, and it bears talking about a little bit why. I think, firstly, there's a lot of parallels to Trump too, which is what makes a lot of the presentation of Reagan so dishonest, because this game was released while Trump was still president, and we weren't yet quite in a post-Trump reality in a sense. And Reagan. Yeah, so let's just draw some of these comparisons. Firstly, Reagan, when he was ascending to power, when he was coming into office, a lot in that campaign leading up to his presidency, a lot of people doubted him, and they doubted him because they thought he was too extreme. They thought he was too conservative to become president. And that, that sounds eerily similar to Trump in a lot of ways. And I know there's a lot of conservative intellectuals who would argue otherwise, and that's fair. But I think both Trump and Reagan share a lot of through lines here. It's just crazy. There was a political message that he even had in his campaign as he was starting to ascend into power. This will sound very similar. So Reagan's slogan was let's make America great again. Not quite MAGA, but it's LaMAGA. LaMAGA, does that sound right?
One letter short. Yeah.
Totally different statements. And he also ascended into power, after an extended career in entertainment and media. And he himself, like Trump, was his most marketable product. Reagan was all about marketing himself. And he was often in cigarette ads and other things. He dodged out of the draft. There's a lot of similar backstory there. Also, some things that we need to talk about. He moved the Overton window. He moved the conversation on a lot of very important topics in this country. One very important one that we're really dealing with the consequences of is poverty. He really reframed the public thought on poverty to more focus on austerity measures to combat it, because poverty, as he saw it and as he proposed, was a personal failure. It is something like a person just failing on their own, and it's all their fault, and they should be punished and ignored and not given any help ever, because that was their mistake. He had a great disdain for impoverished people, and there are quotes from the inside that have since come out saying that if we got a plague in America that just wiped out all the impoverished people, that wouldn't be a bad thing in his mind, which is just. Wow, that is not good. That is not necessarily, how we would want to look up to. And where this all ties back to is that, let's take a step back here. The game presents, the way that Call of Duty presents a Reagan is much like how he presented himself in public, which is kind of this kind, gentle old man, right, who has the goodwill of the people and the public in mind, right, which is. At best, it's just disingenuous. It's not right. It's not true. And I think that's very problematic. I've ranted a little bit on this. Do you have anything you want to say on it, Lee?
Yeah, I would just say, I don't know that the Gippers' attitude towards poor people, as problematic as it is necessarily something that the game would have or should have talked about, and I don't necessarily think if they had shoehorned that in, would have made it a stronger game. However, the Gipper did, as you rightly noted, had a lot of very problematic political and personal viewpoints, many of which would probably have, if they had been expressed, would have made the game much stronger. And I think that sort of gets at something that I have. So background is that I work in marketing. And so a lot of times in marketing, what you're trying to sell isn't necessarily the product itself, rather you're trying to sell the experience that product provides or the problem that it solves. And Call of Duty for the longest time, and I would argue still to this day, maybe not so much with Cold War, at least not with the TV spots, is trying to sell you just having fun with your buddies, right? That's why you saw all of those ads of celebrities and average Joes playing Call of Duty back in the day. I think I want to say, what's the guy from Superbad? That's the one that always sticks out to me.
The bald guy? No, that's not. No, wait, Superbad? No. What is this? No.
Superbad. He's in The Wolf of Wall Street, isn't he? No.
That movie wasn't super good, so I just forgot about it.
Well, that's heresy. So anyways, putting aside that little tirade, I think when you see something like Ronald Reagan as the Gipper, as this genial, convenient figure just being used so loosely, you have to ask yourself, what is this game trying to sell? And it is trying to sell A, fun with your buddies, and then B, this bombastic Cold War era thriller that is based on the truth, quote unquote. And it's not the truth at all, not even remotely. I mean, I'm sure there were Spec Ops missions, but their conception of the Gipper is not the truth. And I think that ends up, A, it rubs a lot of people the wrong way, but then B, when you claim that's not political, it's kind of like, don't be such a wuss. Just take a stand. If they had said that, the Cold War would have been better if the Gipper had just walked into Berlin with an M60 and mowed down a bunch of soldiers. That would have been a far more interesting game to me, because it would have some sort of message than this weird Gipper giving you the go ahead to go do spy shit.
Yeah, and I think you're really kind of chipping away at, I think, one of the core points here, which is that Black Ops Cold War, God, that is a mouthful to say. It's trying to, the experience it's trying to give, the experience is fundamentally different than Spec Ops The Line. And I think that directs a lot of the other decisions that are made downstream. It wants to have this adrenaline, action-packed, kind of fun experience, but it also wants to tie it through historical and political events to kind of give it an interesting aesthetic to promote intrigue. The problem is that it exists at this level, and it's so intertwined or interwoven with the military industrial complex and a lot of the other like aspects in the post 9/11 world that we live in, that it's trying not to necessarily have some of these strong messages, and it's trying to appeal to everyone. But where does that leave it? It leaves it in the default position. And what is the default position of, media that has this right now? It's actually largely conservative militarism. Like when you're
and it's whitewashing. I mean,
yeah,
plain
totally.
and simple is what it is. It's whitewashing a very complicated history, and I get the desire to see things in black and white. We all do. It makes our lives easier. But if you take a conflict, and I'm just going to say the Middle East, right? If you take a conflict like the Middle East, which is extraordinarily complex with shifting alliances, with issues that stem back both hundreds of years and within living memory, that make it almost impossible for anyone to have a coherent, especially US, have a coherent policy in that region. It just feels gross,
Yeah, it feels super gross. And I mean, there's something else to say is that like this game is very US centric. A lot of the media really is like US centric on its perspective. It's very ethnocentric, and it makes it difficult to reckon with a lot of these conflicts in a very genuine way, to never actually like break out of that perspective. It would be exhilarating, just absolutely exhilarating to play like a war game from an entirely like different perspective and have them the main protagonist, because the Call of Duty just as a franchise has that problem that even when you're put in the other when you're put in the shoes of someone else, in a conflict, you're not necessarily playing an American. It's always got that kind of like American perspective and pro-military perspective on just like wiped over everything. You're never really truly getting a genuinely different perspective. Yeah, there's a lot to say on this.
So I want to go rogue for a second. So for context, we're recording this about, let's say, 3 weeks after the 6 Days in Fallujah remake. Or I guess not remake, because that would imply it actually came out. Since 6 Days in Fallujah 2.0 was announced. And so let me just first off by saying, in the context of this video being filmed 3 weeks after, I thought Paul Tomat's comments about the game not being political and about people not wanting to play the game from the perspective of an Iraqi civilian was extremely boneheaded, especially considering the atrocities that were most likely committed in that particular conflict. And I think it's also, we have to note that the company has since walked those comments back, and that Peter is no longer giving interviews. I can't imagine why. I also think it's important to note that the premise of the game could be interesting for some of the reasons you're talking about, that we're talking about. And that is that it adds interviews of soldiers who were in the conflict and who are also in the video game. And I think that's a very good idea, assuming, of course, they feel comfortable talking about that. It was, I know we're saying war crimes, but we weren't there. It's a complex thing. They're human beings too. We have to extend to them some sort of like, I don't want to say benefit of the doubt, but acknowledgement of the situation that they were placed in. And so having that interview combined with the gameplay, I think could make for a very powerful experience. That's what made Band of Brothers such a powerful experience. And to Peter's credit, there is also a part of the game where you play an Iraqi civilian. On the flip side, another thing that made Band of Brothers such a powerful experience was that it also showed things like, the freaking Holocaust. So if you have a similar situation and you're not depicting it, and then you're also, and I'm not trying to say those two things are comparable, but I also don't think you should try to compare war crimes, right? The loss of a single innocent human life is fundamentally tragic, and it doesn't matter how many you lose. It's not a killing contest.
Question of scale. I mean, it is, but it isn't. Like, a single life is a tragedy. But I don't want to even beat around the bush here. He was clear in that, like, some of those initial interviews, I think it was with Polygon. We'll try to find the resources and include them if we can. But he was clear in that initial interview that he didn't want to depict like the white phosphorus scenes in the game that were reported to have happened there from many news outlets. And he said it's because like, you know, that's not what he heard in the interviews with some of the soldiers. He just didn't hear that, and he didn't want this game to become something political. That is fundamentally whitewashing the event. I love that this game is trying to approach the human angle of this and trying to show off different perspectives, the human perspectives on what went down there. I think that's nice, but I think it's a farce. I think it's not good to take this very deeply mired political situation and not try to expose and talk about and air out a lot of those political things. I think it does a disservice to the content. I think it does a disservice to the people there. It just does a disservice to the legacy of the event.
I mean, it's irresponsible to me more than anything else, because whenever you are making something like this, you are in a sense contributing to the recorded history of that event, especially if you are framing your game as a documentary and including documentary footage. And I don't think that 6 Days in Fallujah, who knows? I could be wrong. I don't think it's going to be as popular as Call of Duty. So at the end of the day, it's not as problematic as Call of Duty, but I think it's a good illustration of how insidious, how boneheaded, how hurtful that sort of rhetoric about politics and war can be, but then also why that makes Spec Ops such I don't want to say amazing, because you're dealing with something very meaty and hard and difficult, but that's what makes Spec Ops such a good game, I guess.
Totally. I think getting back to Spec Ops, I think we've leveled a lot of criticism at Call of Duty, a lot of endorsements at Spec Ops, and we have some criticism now prior to 6 Days in Fallujah releasing. I hope it's a phenomenal game. I hope everything I say ends up being wrong and it comes out and it's fantastic. Regardless, I do think I want to, I don't think Spec Ops The Line is necessarily perfect, and I do have some criticisms of it, kind of more abstract things, and one of them is the game is fundamentally a third-person shooting game, and I, noted earlier that it's awesome that it is a shooting game through and through and manages to have this kind of deeper narrative, but I'm not altogether convinced that it being a third-person shooter where you're killing 100 people per minute is necessarily the most meaningful way to convey its narrative in terms of genre, in terms of format, right? And I think that's definitely one of the easiest complaints to level against the game. Would it be better served as a walking simulator? Would it be better served in different ways? Could it exist in different ways? I think, structurally it's difficult to say that, Spec Ops The Line would even be the same game if it didn't have all the shooting, since how everything's so neatly woven together. But I think to make its messages stronger, to make its core points stronger, there are different genres and maybe different mechanical approaches that I'd love to see explored, but also may have complicated it ever getting funding in the first place. So, who's to say? What do you think, Lee?
I obviously think Spec Ops is a great game, but I do think that this is perhaps a good segue to the conclusion of our video, which is the legacy of Spec Ops, because I think I would push back and say that the nature of Spec Ops message is about being sort of anti-interventionism, anti-war. The message strikes so much stronger in that it is a shooter game. And perhaps I would actually say the message might be even better if the game didn't play like ass. If the game's controls felt closer to, say, The Last of Us than it did.
Man, imagine if you got like the writers and a lot of the narrative designers from this game. I mean, the whole team that made this game, talented, of course, but pair them with the pedigree and abilities of like the Naughty Dog with The Last of Us 2. Now imagine this game with the fidelity of Last of Us 2. I think it would take on a whole new level of like meaning and impact, because I think it's the execution where a lot of this game and a lot of my criticism lies necessarily. A lot of the things that could hit so much harder, especially today, almost 10 years on, I think it could be remedied significantly if it sort of had that level of execution.
Oh yeah, totally. Totally, I don't disagree at all there. I also just want to say that I don't think either one of us, I just want to reinforce this point in case anyone has made it this far into this video, is that we're not saying you shouldn't play games like Call of Duty or Battlefield, or that you should feel bad, or that every game should be like this War of Mine or Spec Ops. Those games, Call of Duty, Battlefield, super fun. I'm not gonna try to take some sort of moral high ground that I don't have. However, it gets really tiring shooting brown guys for the better part of 2 decades with the story not changing, right? If you're gonna make me shoot brown guys, at least try to tackle the same subjects or make it mean something. Give me an interesting story. Give me something in the same way that Spec Ops did. Because if we want video games to be taken seriously, if we want them to be seen as an art form, we have to, or they're just always going to be viewed as toys. And then that itself is problematic because then you have Call of Duty as a toy. And that just, I'm not saying that if I have, kids some days that I'm not going to just, I don't know. It's just weird. Like I played violent video games growing up at a young age. And I am reasonably confident that I came out okay. And I'm reasonably confident that most people will come out okay. But I think most people...
So I think,
there's a particular context, right? There's not like they're just playing those games in a vacuum. I had good parents, basically, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, totally. There's something I think we can wrap it back around here, a point that we've made many times up to this point. But, take a look at the media that people consume, not what they ought to be consuming. Don't assume that everyone is paying close attention in their history classes. And in primary school, a lot of those history classes don't even cover these conflicts tragically in enough detail or provide enough breadth and depth to them. Judge them by what they're actually experiencing and playing. And for a lot of people, they get their culture and a lot of the experience with that and engagement with that from these different pieces of media.
And their history lessons too.
Yeah.
Let's just be real.
Yeah, totally. And I think that is where these games arguably get into like the harm conversation. It's not that someone's going to play Call of Duty and then just go like, shooting a lot of guns outside. And there's been a lot of tragedies in the U.S., especially recently with gun violence. And so I don't really want to broach that. But Call of Duty in large is not going to necessarily invoke that behavior. But what it is going to do is going to give misconceptions on history. It's going to whitewash crimes, and it can make us think about political leaders and others in a light which is not necessarily respectful to the history and what actually happened. And I think that's where the harm of this comes in. And to your point, Lee, I think you can totally make fantastic games with just absurd amounts of killing and violence. I mean, you've got the God of War franchise, you've got Doom, you've got so many games out there, of course, more fictionalized that kind of sidestep a lot of the historical complexity of a lot of this. But on the same level, I think you can make a modern warfare shooter. But the act of making a game about war is in itself political, and you have to think about how you're going to set up that conflict, and you have to be cautious about what you're doing, because as we covered, the default, if you say you're non-political and you try to make a game that doesn't dive into the context, you're just going to make something that is more conservative and more militaristic. That is the default. That is like, if you don't engage in these conversations, that's where you end up at.
Yeah, I think a good way of framing that, like in 30 seconds, is that playing Call of Duty in a vacuum might not necessarily make you liable to or go shoot up, fill in whatever tragedy comes to mind, right? Where in America we can think of any of them. However, playing a game like Call of Duty, specifically Call of Duty Cold War, Black Ops, or whatever combination of those words is the correct combination, will make you more likely, I think, to dismiss the sort of, let's just say, hate crimey motivations of individuals that do perpetuate those actions, right? It becomes very easy to sort of otherize the victims of hate crimes. And so when played in a vacuum without any guidance from your parents or any of the America's famously robust and award-winning education system is not a great idea. And I think that's why we need to see games if not take a stance, at least be a little bit more honest about where they're coming from.
Yeah, don't be infinitely postmodern, right? And I think that you said something there, and that kind of hits back to a point that we were touching on earlier. I'm just gonna get through this real quickly here, but in the lineup to releasing the game, there was that famous like know your history ad, and the like snippet it used was from a very famous person, Yuri Bezmenov, who was being interviewed by a very conservative conspiracy theorist, and Yuri Bezmenov himself was a kind of sort of a white nationalist, anti-diversity, super conservative person, and to just drop that quote in there without context is yeah, it's not great, and it lines up with everything that we're saying here. If you're going to make a game that exists in this context, that is a modern warfare game, you have to address it. You have to take a stance and know what you're saying. You can't just extract this quote without context and it like be there. Like a lot of white nationalists and a lot of other radical groups took that ad as like an endorsement of them, and like and after the events of the past several months in the United States, that's scary, frankly. And I'm not saying Call of Duty and that ad is the reason that a lot of these crazy things have been going on, but I'm saying it's like that it's not good. And also death by 1,000 cuts.
Exactly. Yeah, it adds up. Like I am Korean American, and although no one, knock on wood, has ever committed any acts of violence against me, there have been countless examples of microaggressions, or perhaps even macroaggressions, and all of that adds up to create very unpleasant experiences for me that really wear down on the soul. And I think you could say the same thing for someone on the opposite, a very impressionable young suburban teenager, because I was a very impressionable young suburban teenager at one point. And if all you're consuming are games like Call of Duty and you're online being a little edgelord, Lord knows I was, right? And you're just consuming vapid content without any sort of like additional context that frames the situation or teaches you to empathize with people that don't look like you, you might not be leading an armed insurrection at the Capitol after an election, but you're probably going to be pretty okay with that. And that is problematic.
Yeah. So basically, we live in a society.
We live in a society, God damn it. So let's end on a positive note, okay? We've talked a lot about Spec Ops. I think we've established that it is a game of historical merit, and it is also a game that plays like absolute ass. So let's say someone wants to play a game like Spec Ops: The Line, either because of its narrative message or the way it sort of interweaves narrative and mechanics. Where would you find such? What games would you be playing today in March 21st, 2021?
Yeah. If you don't mind me going first here, so I want to start out by saying that truly, Spec Ops: The Line is there's no other Spec Ops game like it, firstly, and secondly, I don't think there's been any game like it since. And so these recommendations come with the caveat that like you're not going to find another game like Spec Ops: The Line. You're going to find analogies, and there's probably going to be disagreements between us on some of these, but you should play Spec Ops: The Line, but some of these other games too also have something to say. And so, yeah, I think, not a happy game. Also another game that's just a massive ball of suffering. But I think The Last of Us 2, there's a lot of discussion and debate on it, but I do think it has something to say. Obviously, it's not an anti-imperialist. It's not necessarily as anti-war. It's different, but it does try to say something with its mechanics and its narrative. It is trying to weave those things together much more than any other AAA game in recent memory of its same scale. And so I think that merits some discussion. Another game that is worth mentioning for how it weaves together mechanics, narrative, and it tries to convey a certain story, which isn't necessarily even about war, but is a game, The Outer Wilds. Not to be confused with The Outer Worlds, but The Outer Wilds, right? Which is kind of a very exciting walking simulator-based game, exploring space, trying to discover what's going on. And it's a fantastic little game. We're probably going to have a future episode about it, spoiler, but Yeah, I think those are some games that stick out to me. What about you, Lee?
Yeah, and I should preface this by saying we were really only thinking about games when we were concepting this episode in our minds within the last 18 months. So I'm sure there are games that you might be thinking of, dear listener, not listeners, dear listener, that we have not listed, and that is very intentional. But also at the same time, if we had extended that time frame, I don't know that we would have found very many other games. We've already talked about one of the most notable games, which is This War of Mine, as well as Metal Gear, right? So games that stick out to me, first off, you have Ancestors, The Humankind Odyssey. It's not really a game about war at all, but it's trying to solve the same sort of mechanical narrative problems that Spec Ops tried to as well. And I think that makes it a very interesting experience, although at times it is very tedious. Similarly, you have Umurangi Generation, which is very, I would say, it is the game of our generation to me. It is, let's just say you are a photographer in a sort of cyberpunk setting. It's a very short game, and we will leave it at that because I don't want to spoil too much of it. But it is probably the closest game on our list to Spec Ops: The Line. And then last, hang on. Actually, I'll just throw out two more examples, and that is the Metro series, a pretty anti-war series, pretty interesting. Not a lot of great stuff going on in terms of weaving its narrative in with its mechanics, although the currency system it uses is interesting, I will say that much. And then you also have Death Stranding, which
God, how did I forget about
is
that?
about as subtle as a bat to the face, but also has some same thoughts as Spec Ops. I think it's interesting to note that with the exception of Metro and Metal Gear, that there's not really any shooters on that list, you know?
Yeah, well, to an extent, I'd say The Last of Us 2 can still qualify as a shooter.
Oh yeah. You know what? It might.
It might.
Opinions split 50-50, but some people, great people, they call it a shooter,
And I think that's totally fair. I was definitely playing Last of Us 2 more like Solid Snake, but if you told me it was a shooter and that was your experience, I couldn't disagree with you. Let's be real.
I murdered everybody in Seattle, so.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing that it's hilarious that on the side here that Kojima has just kind of had this whole career making these games that are subtly like anti-war, but like so many other pieces of media that we've brought up, not everyone has necessarily caught on to that, and there are a lot of people who are super pro-military, pro-war that I just love the Metal Gear franchise, and it's wild. Any Kojima games could really stand in here, but in particular, Death Stranding really stands out for its anti-war message.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
I think that's all I've got, Lee, and I'm happy we can actually end this one on a more positive note. I think there are a lot of games that have recently come out that are trying to bridge a similar gap that I think Spec Ops: The Line was trying to bridge, which is having your mechanics, your narrative, your meta commentary, all of that kind of come together more seamlessly. I'm glad more games are taking that, but Spec Ops: The Line truly was unique in how it had brought all those things together to kind of have an anti-war message. And Call of Duty games still are, I mean, they're trying not to say anything, but they're saying quite a lot about war and conflict. And so, yeah, I would love things to continue improving kind of on that front. But it's really all I've got to say. And I don't know how to end this. So do you know how to end this, Lee?
Well, we could always end it like The Sopranos and just cut it off midway through. And maybe